They say every bride is radiant on her wedding day, but something was different about Sarah Mitchell that morning. Perhaps it was the way she held herself at the altar, or how her laugh seemed to catch slightly when she spoke. Michael Coleman, the groom, couldn't shake the feeling that the woman before him had changed, subtly, inexplicably. As he looked into her eyes, searching for the familiar warmth he'd grown to love, a chilling realization began to dawn. The woman in the white dress wasn't Sarah at all, but her younger sister, Rachel. The wedding program trembled in his hands as the truth settled in his mind, leaving him standing before family and friends with a decision that would alter 3 lives forever. What could drive a sister to take such a drastic step on the most important day of their lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 hours earlier, Sarah Mitchell sat at her childhood vanity, fingers tracing the worn edges of a leather-bound photo album, while her makeup artist arranged brushes with methodical precision. The morning light filtered through gauzy curtains, casting a soft glow on photographs that chronicled 28 years of sisterhood, some corners curled, others meticulously preserved. "Just a few more minutes, Miss Mitchell," the makeup artist murmured, selecting a shade that would enhance Sarah's natural features rather than transform them. Sarah nodded, her attention caught by a particular photograph. 2 little girls in matching Easter dresses, Rachel's smile wide and uninhibited, her own more reserved, measured. Even then, the differences between them had been evident. She turned the page, revealing a snapshot from their high school years. Rachel, perpetually in motion, captured mid-laugh at a family barbecue. Sarah stood slightly apart, poised and proper, already shouldering the expectations that came with being the eldest Mitchell daughter. Their mother had always said Sarah was born responsible, while Rachel was born to challenge every rule ever written. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Sarah's attention to the doorway. Her mother appeared, elegant in her navy dress, carrying a garment bag with reverent care. "It's time, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying that particular softness reserved for significant moments. "Are you ready?" Sarah closed the album, setting it aside with deliberate care. "Of course, Mother. I've been ready for this day since Michael proposed." The words came automatically, practiced and perfect, like everything else about this wedding. She stood, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her silk robe, as her mother unzipped the garment bag, revealing the dress Sarah had spent months selecting. A subtle unease settled in her stomach. The dress was everything she'd wanted. Classic. Lines, delicate beading, a testament to understated elegance. Yet something about seeing it now, in the morning light of her childhood bedroom, made it seem suddenly foreign. "Rachel's running a bit behind with her bridesmaid preparations," her mother mentioned, carefully lifting the dress from its protective cocoon. "You know how she is with timelines." There was a familiar note of disapproval in her voice, one that had colored conversations about Rachel throughout their lives. Sarah felt a familiar tug of responsibility. "I should check on her," she said, moving toward the door, but her mother's gentle hand stopped her. "Let her be, Sarah. Today is your day. For once, let someone else manage Rachel." The words carried the weight of years of Sarah smoothing over her sister's impulsiveness, years of being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who never caused a moment's worry. The makeup artist finished her work, and Sarah studied her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked exactly as a bride should, serene, beautiful, composed. She thought of Michael waiting at the church, his steady presence an anchor in her carefully planned life. Michael, who appreciated order and tradition as much as she did. Michael, who had never once confused her for her more vivacious sister, as so many others had throughout their lives. A burst of laughter floated up from the garden below. Rachel's unmistakable laugh, bright and unrestrained. Sarah found herself drawn to the window, watching as her sister charmed the photography team with what was undoubtedly another spontaneous story. Even from this distance, Rachel's vitality was evident in every gesture, every movement. Sarah's fingers found the edge of the photo album again, opening to a recent picture, her engagement party. In it, she stood between Michael and Rachel, her sister's arm thrown casually around her shoulders, Michael's smile polite and proper. She studied her own expression in the photograph, searching for something she couldn't quite name. Sarah? Her mother's voice broke through her reverie. The dress? Yes, of course. Sarah turned from the window, from thoughts she shouldn't be. Having on her wedding day. This was what she had always wanted, wasn't it? A perfect wedding, a perfect husband, a perfect life stretched out before her like a path she had spent years carefully paving. She stepped into the dress, feeling the weight of silk and expectations settle around her. In the mirror, she was every inch the bride she had always imagined she would be. Yet as she stood there, surrounded by the trappings of her childhood room and memories captured in that weathered album, Sarah Mitchell felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before: doubt. Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor of the guest bedroom, still in her silk robe, surrounded by the ordered chaos of wedding preparations. Her bridesmaid's dress hung on the door, a tasteful shade of sage that Sarah had chosen because it complemented everyone's complexion. Everything about this wedding was perfectly Sarah, elegant, controlled, and utterly predictable. The wedding invitation lay in her lap, its cream-colored cardstock thick and expensive. Rachel's fingers traced the embossed letters. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell and Michael James Coleman request the honor of your presence. The formal words blurred as she blinked back unexpected tears. Last night's rehearsal dinner replayed in her mind. Michael's best man had told the story of how Michael and Sarah met at a charity gala, both serving on the board of directors. It was like they were made for each other, he'd said, raising his glass. Two people who always color inside. The lines. Rachel had watched Michael during the toast, noticed how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. She'd seen that same look 3 months ago when she'd bumped into him at that little coffee shop downtown, the one Sarah would never set foot in because it was too bohemian. They'd talked for hours that day about art and travel and dreams that didn't fit into neat corporate boxes. Michael had laughed then, really laughed, his whole face lighting up as Rachel described her misadventures teaching art to kindergartners. The invitation crumpled slightly in her hands as the memory washed over her. She'd gone home that night and cried for the first time since Sarah's engagement, though she couldn't explain why to anyone who asked, not even to herself. A knock at the door startled her. Rachel? Her mother's voice tinged with that familiar note of exasperation. Everyone's waiting for you. The photographer wants to start the pre-ceremony shots. Just a minute, Rachel called back, hearing the retreating clicks of her mother's heels. She stood, the invitation falling to the floor, one corner tearing as it caught on her pedicured toe. She moved to the full-length mirror, studying her reflection. People always said she and Sarah could be twins, despite the 2-year age gap. Same honey blonde hair, same green eyes, same heart-shaped face. But where Sarah wore their shared features like armor, perfectly composed and controlled, Rachel's always seemed to betray every emotion that flitted through her mind. The torn invitation caught her eye in the mirror's reflection. A small voice, in her head, one that sounded suspiciously like Sarah, whispered that she should pick it up, smooth it out, preserve the proper order of things. Instead, Rachel found herself walking to Sarah's room, drawn by an impulse she didn't quite understand. The door was ajar. Sarah had gone downstairs for final photography instructions, leaving her wedding dress laid out on the bed like a ghost. Of expectations, Rachel approached it slowly, her heart pounding with a rhythm that felt like destiny and disaster intertwined. Her fingers brushed the silk, feeling its cool smoothness. This wasn't just a dress. It was everything Sarah had ever Been and everything Rachel had never managed to become. Responsible, reliable, right. "Sarah?" Michael's voice drifted up from the garden below. Rachel moved to the window, watching as he stood with the photography team, handsome in his morning suit, checking his watch with that slight furrow between his brows that appeared whenever. He was uncomfortable with the situation's lack of structure. She saw the exact moment he spotted someone in the garden, his face softening, that furrow smoothing out, a genuine smile breaking through his professional facade. Rachel's heart clenched as she realized he was looking at her abandoned coffee cup on the garden wall, the one with the whimsical doodles she'd drawn on the sleeve during the morning's preparations. The torn invitation lay forgotten on the guest room floor as Rachel made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. With trembling fingers, she reached for her sister's wedding dress, understanding with perfect clarity that some lines weren't meant to stay uncolored, some rules were meant to be broken, and some loves were worth the chaos they created. She slipped out of her robe, the silk of the wedding dress cool against her skin. In the mirror, she looked exactly like Sarah, except for her eyes. In her eyes, she saw the truth that would soon unravel everything. Sometimes the wrong choice was the only right one to make. Eleanor Mitchell had always prided herself on knowing her daughters. So when she climbed the stairs to hurry them along, the leather-bound diary tucked in her dresser drawer weighing on her mind, she noticed immediately that something was different. The air itself seemed charged with an electricity she recognized. All too well, the kind that preceded life-changing decisions. She paused outside Sarah's door, watching her younger daughter adjust the wedding veil with trembling fingers. The sight sent her thoughts spinning back 30 years, to another bride, another dress, another moment of doubt, captured in fading ink on the pages of her diary. "Rachel," she called softly, using her eldest's name even as her heart recognized the truth. The figure in the mirror stiffened almost imperceptibly, then turned with Sarah's practiced smile. But Rachel had never quite mastered her sister's ability to keep emotions from dancing in her eyes. Eleanor's hand found the doorframe for support as memories flooded back, herself at 23, writing in that diary by candlelight. "Today, I chose security over passion," she had written. "Mother says I'll thank myself later." The pages that followed chronicled years of a marriage built on respect rather than love, stability rather than joy. "Everything's fine, Mother," Rachel said in a voice that was almost, but not quite, Sarah's. "I'm just having a final moment alone before the ceremony." Eleanor stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. In the silence that followed, she could hear the bustling preparations. Downstairs, the photographer calling out directions, the wedding planner's efficient commands. A world of careful planning continuing on, unaware that its center was shifting. "Where is your sister?" she asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew. Sarah would be in the garden chapel's small anteroom by now, wearing Rachel's bridesmaid dress, perhaps wondering if anyone would notice, perhaps hoping they would. Rachel's composure faltered for just a moment. "Mother, "You look beautiful in the dress," Eleanor interrupted, surprising them both. She moved closer, adjusting the veil with practiced hands. "Your grandmother's pearls suit you." Her fingers lingered on the strand she'd fastened around Rachel's neck earlier, believing she was helping her eldest daughter prepare for her wedding day. "You're not going to stop me." Rachel's whisper held equal parts hope and fear. Eleanor withdrew her hands, studying her younger daughter's face. She saw in it echoes of her own youth, of choices made and unmade, of paths taken and forsaken. The diary in her drawer held 30 years of quiet regrets, of wondering what might have been if she'd listened to her heart instead of her head. "There are many kinds of love," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "The kind that looks good on paper, that builds solid foundations and respectable lives. And then there's the kind that burns so bright it frightens. As the kind that demands everything and promises nothing except that we'll be truly, completely ourselves." She touched Rachel's cheek gently. I've watched Michael with both of you. He's a good man, the kind who would build a perfect life. With Sarah, one that would never crack or crumble. But with you—" She paused, remembering the way Michael's eyes had followed Rachel at family gatherings, how his careful reserve melted away in her presence. "With you, he comes alive." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Sarah will never forgive me." "Perhaps not." Eldinor agreed, thinking of her diary, of the silence that had grown between her and her own sister after she'd chosen the safer path. But someday she might thank you. Sometimes the greatest act of love is forcing someone to face the truth they've been hiding from themselves. She stepped back, surveying her daughter one final time. In the wedding dress, Rachel looked like a classical painting come to life, beautiful, but with an untamed energy that no amount of silk and lace could contain. The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. Whatever happens next will change everything. Rachel nodded, understanding the weight of what remained unspoken between them. Eleanor turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Rachel, the love that frightens us, that's usually the one worth fighting for." As she closed the door behind her, Eleanor thought of the diary waiting in her drawer, of its pages filled with the careful documentation of a life lived exactly as expected. Perhaps it was time to write a new entry, one that began, "Today I watched my daughter choose passion over security, and in her courage I finally found my own." Sarah's phone buzzed against the wooden pew of the garden chapel's anteroom, its screen illuminating with a message that made her hands tremble. "I'm sorry, but we both know this isn't your happy ending." She stared at her sister's words, her bridesmaid's dress feeling suddenly tight across her chest. Around her, the small room hummed with last-minute preparations. The wedding planner's heels clicking against hardwood, flowers being adjusted, voices calling out final instructions. Nobody had noticed yet that the bride they were all preparing to celebrate wasn't wearing white. Another message appeared. "You never wanted the spotlight, Sarah. You wanted the approval." Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard, remembering all their late-night conversations over the years. How Rachel would curl up on her bed, asking questions Sarah never wanted to answer. "Are you happy? Do you love him? Or do you love the life he represents?" The wedding planner bustled past, clipboard in hand. 15 minutes, everyone. Has anyone seen Rachel? She needs to line up with the other bridesmaids." Sarah's reply came slowly, each word carefully chosen. "You have no right to make this choice for me." 3 dots appeared on her screen, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, someone had to. "You've spent so long being the perfect daughter, you've forgotten how to be yourself." Outside, the string quartet began their prelude. Sarah recognized the piece. She had selected it herself, like everything else about this wedding, with careful consideration of tradition and expectations. She couldn't remember if she actually liked it. "What about Michael?" she typed, her thumb pressing harder than necessary on each letter. "Did you think about what this will do to him?" Rachel's response was immediate. "I think about him all the time." That's part of the problem, isn't it? The truth of those words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought of all the times she'd caught Michael looking at Rachel, his usual reserve melting away, how he came alive in her sister's presence, laughing at her impulsive jokes, engaging in passionate debates about art and life and dreams. With Sarah, he was proper, contained, perfect, just like she was. 5 minutes to places. The wedding planner's voice carried a note of panic now. "Has anyone seen Rachel?" Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. "I love you enough to stop you from making the biggest mistake of your life. And I love him enough to give him the chance at real happiness, even if it costs me everything." The screen blurred as tears threatened to fall. Sarah blinked them back, years of practice keeping her composure intact. Another message appeared, this one from their mother. "Whatever happens next, remember that true love should make you more yourself, not less." Sarah stood, smoothing the sage-green fabric of her sister's bridesmaid dress. Through the anteroom's window, she could see the gathered guests, the anxious best man, and Michael, standing at the altar, checking his watch with that familiar furrow between his brows. Her phone buzzed one last time. Rachel again. "When you picked this dress for me, you said sage green symbolizes new beginnings. Maybe it's time for yours." The wedding planner appeared in the doorway, face flushed with relief. "There you are. Quick, get in line with the other bridesmaids. The bride's about to make her entrance." Sarah nodded, slipping her phone into the hidden pocket of her dress. As she took her place in line, she caught a glimpse of white through the chapel doors. Rachel, wearing the dress meant for her, looking somehow more bride-like than Sarah had in all her fittings. The string quartet transitioned to the wedding march. Sarah watched as heads turned, as Michael's eyes fixed on the figure in white. She saw the exact moment he realized something was different, saw confusion flicker across his face, followed by something else. Something that looked remarkably like relief. In her pocket, her phone held the digital proof of a truth she'd been avoiding for months. But it was the silence between those messages that spoke the loudest, her own inability to type the words, "I love him," even once in their entire exchange. Michael Coleman had always taken pride in his attention to detail. As a corporate lawyer, it was this trait that had built his reputation, the ability to spot the subtle discrepancies that others missed. Now, standing at the altar, that same gift was becoming his torment. His hand moved unconsciously to his pocket where the wedding ring waited. He remembered the day he'd had it inscribed, choosing words that seemed appropriate for Sarah. Forever, in perfect order. She had always appreciated his methodical nature, his careful planning. It was one of the many ways they matched, like pieces in a well-structured puzzle. The woman in white moved closer, each step precise, practiced. But something was off, a subtle difference in the rhythm of her walk, the way her fingers gripped the bouquet just a fraction too tightly. Sarah had always held flowers delicately, as if afraid of disturbing their arrangement. This grip spoke of barely contained emotion. The morning sun caught the diamond of her engagement ring, and Michael's mind flashed back to the day he'd proposed. It had been perfectly orchestrated. The five-star restaurant, the string quartet, the champagne served at exactly the right moment. Sarah had accepted with a gentle smile and a nod, exactly as he'd expected. It was Rachel who had burst into tears. At the announcement dinner later that evening, excusing herself from the table so abruptly that her chair had toppled over. Now, as the bride drew closer, Michael caught a hint of perfume. Not Sarah's usual subtle floral scent, but something wilder, more complex. Something that reminded him of afternoon conversations in a coffee shop he'd never meant to enter, of laughter that broke all the rules of proper social etiquette, of eyes that challenged him to step outside his carefully constructed boundaries. The best man shifted beside him, probably wondering why Michael's usual composed expression had faltered. But how could he explain what he was seeing? The way the bride's eyes seemed to hold a different light, how her presence carried an energy that Sarah had never possessed. His thoughts drifted to the ring in his pocket again, its inscription suddenly feeling like a weight. Sarah had never asked to see it, accepting his suggestion that they maintain at least one traditional surprise for the ceremony. But Rachel had asked, during one of their chance encounters, had challenged him actually, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Let me guess. Something perfectly proper and perfectly boring." The bride was only steps away now. Michael's legal training kicked in, his mind cataloguing the evidence, the subtle differences in posture, the barely perceptible tremor in her hands, the way she seemed to vibrate with an energy Sarah always worked to contain. Then there was the final damning detail. When their eyes met, she didn't give him Sarah's practiced smile. Instead, her lips quivered with invulnerability that made his heart race in a way that all of Sarah's perfection never had. In that moment, Michael understood what his subconscious had been trying to tell him since the first notes of the wedding march. The woman walking toward him was wearing Sarah's dress, carrying Sarah's bouquet, but beneath the veil, she moved with Rachel's untamed grace. The realization should have filled him with anger, with betrayal, with all the proper emotions a groom should feel upon discovering such deception. Instead, as he watched Rachel take those final steps toward him, all he felt was a profound sense of relief, as if a door he'd been forever walking past had suddenly blown open, revealing the path he should have taken all along. His fingers touched the ring in his pocket one last time, its inscription now feeling like a question rather than a statement. Perhaps some things weren't meant to be kept in perfect order. Perhaps the greatest moments in life were the ones that broke all the rules. The officiant's voice carried across the garden chapel with practiced solemnity. Marriage is a sacred union, entered into with both heart and mind. In the front row, Eleanor Mitchell's hands clasped tighter in her lap, watching the subtle play of emotions across Michael's face as he stood before the woman in white. Rachel felt the weight of Sarah's carefully written vows in her hands, the paper crisp and precise, each word thoughtfully selected over weeks of consideration. Her sister's elegant handwriting flowed across the page. "I promise to be your harbor in every storm, your partner in every endeavor, your companion in a life built on mutual respect and understanding." Perfect words for a perfect couple. Except they weren't perfect at all, were they? The officiant turned to Michael first, as tradition dictated. His voice carried clearly as he began the vows they had all expected him to deliver. "I, Michael James Coleman, take you." The briefest pause, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't watching as closely as Rachel was. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "To be my lawfully wedded wife." In the second row, his mother dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief, misinterpreting her son's emotion as traditional wedding day sentiment. But Rachel saw the question in his gaze, the dawning understanding that made her heart race beneath the borrowed dress. When it was her turn, Rachel's fingers trembled as she unfolded Sarah's vows. The words swam before her eyes, each perfectly chosen phrase suddenly feeling like a testament to everything her sister had sacrificed in the name of propriety. Her voice caught, and she cleared her throat. In the third row, Aunt Margaret whispered something about bride's nerves, but it wasn't nerves making Rachel's voice shake. It was the weight of truth pressing against her chest, demanding to be spoken. She looked down at Sarah's vows again, then slowly, deliberately, folded the paper and slipped it back into her bouquet. When she spoke, it was from her heart, her words falling like pebbles into still water. "I stand here today, not as the woman you expected, but as the woman who has loved you from across rooms filled with polite conversation, from behind the shields we built to protect ourselves from feeling too much." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I promise not a life of perfect order, but one of authentic chaos, not a partnership built on what others expect, but one forged in the fire of who we truly are." A murmur rippled through the gathered guests. In the back row, someone whispered, "That doesn't sound like Sarah at all." The truth was beginning to dawn, spreading through the assembly like a slow-moving wave. Michael's eyes never left her face. The furrow between his brows, the one that appeared whenever life colored outside his carefully drawn lines, had smoothed away. In its place was an expression Rachel had seen only once before, that afternoon in the coffee shop when they'd talked for hours about dreams they'd never dared to voice aloud. The officiant cleared his throat, clearly unsure how to proceed with a ceremony that had veered so far from its scripted path. But before he could speak, movement at the back of the chapel drew everyone's attention. Sarah stood in the doorway, still wearing Rachel's bridesmaid dress, her face a complex mixture of emotions Rachel had never seen her sister allow herself to display before. Their eyes met across the space that had always existed between them, the space between the sister who followed every rule and the one who questioned them all. In that moment, as the afternoon sun streamed through the chapel, windows and the scent of roses hung heavy in the air. 3 hearts beat with the same painful truth. Sometimes the greatest act of love is destroying the carefully constructed facade that keeps us from living authentically. The officiant's voice shook slightly as he continued, "If anyone knows any reason why these two should not be joined in matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah took a step forward, then stopped, her hand pressed against her heart. Rachel held her breath, waiting for the anger, the denouncement, the proper response to such an improper act. Instead, Sarah's voice carried clearly through the chapel. Sometimes the wrong bride is the right choice. The guest book lay open on an antique desk in the reception hall, its cream-colored pages gradually filling with messages that revealed far more than their writers intended. The wedding planner had placed it there hours ago, expecting the usual collection of well-wishes and platitudes. Instead, it became a chronicle of whispered truths and shifting perspectives. To the bride and groom, Michael's aunt had written before the ceremony, "May your life together be as perfectly ordered as your courtship." The ink had barely dried when the truth emerged, turning her traditional sentiment into unintended irony. Now, as the reception unfolded in a blur of awkward conversations and careful avoidance, new messages appeared, each one capturing the ripples of shock still moving through the gathering. "Love finds its own path, wishing you both the courage this journey will require. Eleanor Mitchell." The mother of the bride's message stood out, her usually pristine handwriting bearing the slight tremor of emotional upheaval. Below it, Michael's father had written nothing, leaving only a heavy ink blot where his pen had rested too long against the page. Rachel stood at the edge of the dance floor, still wearing Sarah's wedding dress, watching guests approach the book. With varying degrees of hesitation, some wrote quickly and escaped, others lingered, as if hoping their careful choice of words might somehow make sense of what they'd witnessed. "I always knew you were different from the rest of us," her cousin Jane had written, the words carrying an accusation wrapped in false understanding. "May your unconventional choice bring you the happiness you seek." The first dance approached, that carefully choreographed moment Rachel and Michael had never rehearsed. She'd watched Sarah practice with him, their movements precise and practiced, like everything else about their relationship. Now, as the orchestra struck up the opening notes of "The Way You Look Tonight," Rachel felt the weight of all those unrehearsed moments stretching before them. Michael appeared at her side, his bow tie slightly loosened, a change that seemed to reflect the unraveling of his own carefully constructed world. "They're all waiting," he said softly, "to see if we know the steps. I never learned them," Rachel admitted, watching another guest approach the book with obvious reluctance. "Sarah tried to teach me, but you preferred to dance your own way." His voice held a warmth that had never been there when he spoke to Sarah, a recognition of something wild and true. He held out his hand. "Show me." They moved onto the dance floor as someone wrote in the book, "Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with an act of courage or madness. Time will tell which this is." Rachel stepped into Michael's arms, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his frame. Then she did what she'd always done best. She broke the rules. Instead of the formal dance position Sarah had practiced, she drew closer, resting her head against his chest. After a moment's hesitation, she felt him relax, his arms tightening around her as they swayed to the music, ignoring the practiced steps in favor of something more genuine. From across the room, she caught glimpses of Sarah, still in the sage green bridesmaid's dress, speaking quietly with their mother. Her sister's face showed none of the anger Rachel had expected, only a complex mixture of relief and resignation that made her heart ache in unexpected ways. New messages continued. To fill the guest book, to find truth in chaos requires more courage than maintaining order in lies. Unsigned, may you both remember this day not for its scandal but for its honesty. The Reverend James. I've watched 3 generations of Mitchell women choose safety over passion. Thank you for breaking the chain. Great Aunt Rose. As the evening deepened, the messages grew more honest, as if the wine and fading light gave people permission to speak their hidden truths. I wish I'd had your courage 30 years ago. Eleanor's sister Catherine, to the woman who dared and the man who recognized truth when it walked down the aisle wearing the wrong dress. The wedding planner. The final page of the guest book held only one message, written in Sarah's precise hand. Some prisons are built of silk and expectations. Thank you for setting us both free. Rachel's fingers traced her sister's words as Michael's hand found hers, warm and steady. Around them, the reception continued its uncertain dance between scandal and celebration, between judgment and understanding. But here, in this moment, with Sarah's blessing inked onto the page and Michael's thumb tracing circles on her palm, Rachel finally understood. Sometimes, the greatest acts of love are the ones that shatter our perfectly constructed worlds, forcing us to build something real from the pieces. In the venue's security office, a bank of monitors captured the day's events from angles no guest would ever see. The timestamp on camera 3 read 9:47 a.m., less than 2 hours before the ceremony, as it recorded Sarah's first moment of true hesitation. She stood alone in the bride's room, one hand pressed against the glass of the window, watching the gardeners arrange the last of the white roses. The camera's unblinking eye caught what the wedding photographers missed. Her shoulders dropping, her carefully maintained posture crumbling for exactly 37 seconds before she rebuilt her walls. Camera 2, positioned in the hallway, showed Rachel passing by at 10:03 a.m., carrying her bridesmaid's dress. She paused outside Sarah's door, her hand hovering over the knob. The footage captured her reflection in a decorative mirror, the exact moment indecision transformed into determination. The head of security, Thomas Walsh, had worked hundreds of weddings over his 20 years at the venue, but something about this morning's footage made him linger over his coffee, watching events unfold with the attention of someone who recognized the weight of what he was witnessing. Camera 4, 10:15 a.m. Eleanor Mitchell stood in the garden, phone pressed to her ear. The camera's microphone picked up fragments of her conversation. Margaret, do you remember that summer in Paris? When I almost... The rest was lost to static, but her expression spoke volumes. At 10:22 a.m., camera 1 captured the moment that would later be discussed in whispered conversations for years to come. Sarah and Rachel, alone in the bride's room, standing before the full-length mirror. No audio, but their reflections told the story. 2 sisters, identical yet utterly different, one in white, one in sage green. The security footage showed what the guests would never see: Sarah reaching out first, helping Rachel with the zipper of the wedding dress. Her hands steady, deliberate, as if each movement was both a surrender and a liberation. 24 a.m. Camera 3. Michael in the groom's suite, loosening his tie, then tightening it again. Picking up his phone, setting it down. Opening his wallet to remove a worn piece of paper, a coffee shop receipt covered in doodles of flowers and birds, signed with a simple R. Camera 6, 10:30 a.m. Eleanor, returning to the bride's room. The footage showed her pause in the doorway, taking in the scene before her. The camera caught the subtle shift in her stance, spine straightening, chin lifting, as she made her own choice about which truth to support. 35 a.m. Camera 2. Sarah, now wearing the bridesmaid's dress, slipping into the chapel's anteroom. The camera's angle revealed what she held in her hands, not just her carefully written vows, but also a small notebook. Its pages, visible for just a moment, filled with crossed-out drafts of a letter that began, "Dear Michael, I think we both..." No. The most revealing footage came from camera 5 at 10:40 a.m. The angle captured both sisters in the same frame for the last time before the ceremony. No words were exchanged, but their gazes met in the mirror, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. Sarah's hand brushed Rachel's shoulder, a gesture that could have been straightening the wedding dress, but looked remarkably like a blessing. Thomas Walsh watched the monitors as the morning unfolded, recognizing the subtle choreography of fate and choice. He'd seen thousands of brides prepare for their weddings, but never had he witnessed such a delicate dance of truth and deception, love and liberation. 50 a.m. All cameras. The wedding party taking their positions. Sarah in sage green slipping into the anteroom. Rachel in white standing at the chapel doors. Eleanor, composed but with tears in her eyes, touching both her daughter's cheeks in passing. And Michael at the altar, adjusting his cuffs with hands that trembled just enough for the camera to catch. The footage ended there, the rest of the story playing out in full view of the guests. But these private moments, captured by unblinking electronic eyes, revealed what the wedding album never would. How three hearts found their truth in the spaces between tradition and desire, duty and courage, the carefully planned and the gloriously unexpected. As the reception wound down, Eleanor retreated to her study, drawn to the mahogany desk where 3 generations of Mitchell women had written their letters, kept their secrets, and made their choices. From the bottom drawer, she withdrew a yellowed envelope, its seal broken decades ago, but its contents still sharp enough to draw blood. The letter was dated June 15th, 1962, written in her mother's distinctive hand. My dearest Helen, by the time you read this, I will be married to Charles Mitchell, not you. The papers will call it a beautiful ceremony, everything a Mitchell wedding should be. They won't mention how your hands trembled when you helped me into your wedding dress this morning, or how your eyes held more relief than grief when you stepped aside. We both know why you're reading this letter instead of exchanging vows. We both know what I saw 2 weeks ago in the garden. You and Margaret sharing the kind of kiss that changes everything, the kind of love that terrifies our parents. Simply because it's real, I'll be the dutiful Mitchell bride today. I'll say the right words, smile at the right moments, and give our family the perfect society wedding they expect. But know this, I do this not to steal your happiness, but to protect it. In this world we live in, my conventional marriage will draw all eyes away from your unconventional heart. You once told me that love should feel like flying, not like putting on a well-tailored coat. I didn't understand then. I do now. Take Margaret and go to Paris as you've dreamed. I'll handle mother and father's disappointment, their questions, their thinly veiled relief that at least one daughter knows her place. My wedding gift to you is your freedom, the chance to live a life unfettered by the golden chains of Mitchell expectations. Perhaps one day our children will live in a world where love needs no disguise, where happiness wears no mask. Until then, know that every time I sign my name as Mrs. Charles Mitchell, I do so knowing my sister is dancing in Parisian cafes, loving freely and living truly. With all my heart, Catherine. Eleanor's hands shook as she read the letter again, understanding for the first time why her mother had always changed the subject when asked about her Aunt Helen. Why there were no family photos of Paris, despite the postcards that arrived for years, signed simply H&M. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Another Mitchell wedding, another sister's sacrifice, another chance at genuine happiness hanging in the balance. But this time the roles were reversed. The bride stepping aside, the sister stepping forward, both choosing truth over tradition. From her desk drawer, Eleanor retrieved her own collection of secrets. Newspaper clippings about her Aunt Helen's art gallery in Montmartre, candid photos of 2 women growing old together in a city of light and love, and finally, the obituary that had arrived 5 years ago. Helen Mitchell Dubois, renowned artist and gallery owner, passed away peacefully in Paris, surrounded by love. She is survived by her longtime partner, Margaret Blackwood. The sound of laughter drifted in from the garden, Rachel's unmistakable joy mingling with Michael's deeper tones. Eleanor moved to the window, watching as her younger daughter taught her new husband some improvised dance steps. Their formal wedding clothes delightfully disheveled, their happiness unmarred by the whispers and stares of departing guests. Sarah sat nearby, her bridesmaid's dress catching the evening light. She was smiling, not her usual measured expression, but something softer, more genuine. As Eleanor watched, her eldest daughter slipped off her uncomfortable heels and leaned back in her chair, a small act of rebellion against a lifetime of perfect posture. Eleanor's fingers found the final item in her desk, a one-way ticket to Florence that had arrived last month. Sarah had kept it secret, along with her acceptance letter to an art restoration program she'd never dared mention to anyone. Now, watching her daughter's quiet contentment, Eleanor understood. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of the life we thought we should want. She returned to her desk and began to write, her pen moving swiftly across cream-colored paper. My dearest girls, today you both chose truth over tradition, courage over convenience. You make me think of another pair of Mitchell sisters who once faced a similar choice. Let me tell you about your great-aunt Helen, who found her happiness in Paris, and the sister who loved her enough to set her free. The garden lights cast long shadows across her desk as Eleanor wrote deep into the evening, unfolding a family history of love, sacrifice, and the quiet rebellion of choosing authenticity over expectation. Outside, the new couple danced on, while Sarah planned her escape to Florence, each of them writing their own chapters in the Mitchell family legacy of finding freedom in unexpected ways. It was the champagne glass that shattered first, slipping from Michael's mother's fingers as she finally voiced what many guests had been whispering behind covered mouths. How do we even know if this marriage is legal? She signed her sister's name. The crystal shards scattered across the parquet floor like ice, catching the evening light. Rachel felt the delicate lace of Sarah's wedding dress catch on one of the reception chairs as she turned toward the sound. A small tear started at the hem, the first imperfection in the perfect dress that had helped her become someone else for a day. Miranda, please. Michael stepped forward, his voice carrying that careful lawyer's tone he used in difficult negotiations. But his mother was past being managed, past keeping up appearances, past pretending this was anything but what it was, a scandal that would echo through Newport's social circles for years to come. Don't Miranda me, Michael James Coleman. I watched you build a life of careful choices, of responsible decisions, and now— She gestured wildly at Rachel, at the torn wedding dress, at the disorder her younger son had introduced into their orderly world. Now you're throwing it all away for the impulsive sister, the one who changes jobs every 2 years, the one who still hasn't figured out what she wants to be when she grows up. The tear in the dress crept higher as Rachel moved, the sound of ripping lace barely audible over the murmurs of remaining guests. She felt Michael tense beside her, saw his jaw clench in that way it did when he was holding back words that needed to be said. But it was Sarah who spoke first, rising from her seat at the family table, still wearing Rachel's bridesmaid dress. That's exactly why they belong together, Miranda. Her voice carried the weight of years spent watching, understanding, holding her tongue. Because Rachel knows who she is, even if that person doesn't fit into our perfectly arranged boxes. And your son, your brilliant, responsible son, has spent his entire life being who everyone expected him to be instead of who he truly is. The dress tore again as Rachel turned to look at her sister. In the deepening evening light, she could see traces of the little girl who had always protected her, who had shouldered the weight of family expectations so Rachel could run free. Sarah, Eleanor warned softly, but Sarah was done being careful, done being proper, done being the perfect Mitchell daughter. No, Mother, they need to hear this. We all do. Sarah moved to stand beside Rachel, her fingers finding the torn lace of the wedding dress. "Do you know what I felt when I realized what Rachel had done?" Relief, pure, overwhelming relief. Because she had the courage to do what I couldn't, to stop pretending that a life built on expectations is the same thing as a life built on love. The dress ripped further as Sarah's fingers caught in the lace, the sound like a confession in the sudden silence. Michael's father stood up, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment or both. "This is absolutely beautiful," Michael interrupted, his voice stronger than Rachel had ever heard it. "This is absolutely beautiful." He moved to stand between Rachel and his parents, but his eyes were fixed on the torn wedding dress, on the way it now hung imperfectly on Rachel's frame. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I want to be, with exactly who I want to be with, not because it's the right choice on paper, but because it's the right choice in my heart." Rachel felt tears warm on her cheeks as the dress tore. Again, this time from her own movement as she reached for Michael's hand. Around them, the carefully constructed world of social expectations and proper behavior was unraveling just like the delicate lace. "I did sign my own name," she said quietly, but her voice carried in the tense silence. "On the marriage license, I wouldn't start a life with Michael based on a lie, even if the ceremony itself was unconventional." Eleanor stepped forward, her hands smoothing over the torn fabric of the wedding dress in an instinctive gesture of maternal care. "The dress was never meant to last forever," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's what happens after we take it off that matters." The final tear came as Rachel turned to embrace her mother, the sound of rending lace like a period at the end of a long sentence. The perfect dress was ruined, but as she stood there, surrounded by the debris of shattered expectations and broken traditions, Rachel had never felt more beautiful. Sarah reached out, carefully unpinning the veil from Rachel's hair. "Some things need to break," she said softly, "so we can stop trying to fix them and finally build something new instead." The remaining guests watched in stunned silence as the last piece of the perfect Mitchell wedding came undone. But in the growing darkness of the reception hall, with champagne soaking into the parquet floor and the wedding dress hanging in elegant tatters, three hearts beat with the same liberating truth. Sometimes we have to tear apart the life we've sewn ourselves into before we can stitch together the one we're meant to live. In the quiet of the garden chapel's anteroom, Sarah found her journal exactly where she'd left it that morning, tucked beneath a pile of wedding programs. The leather-bound book had been her silent confidant for the past year, its pages holding truths she'd never dared speak aloud. As the sounds of the reception's aftermath drifted through the windows, she opened to her first entry about Michael. Dated exactly 1 year ago, he proposed tonight. Everything was perfect. The restaurant, the ring, the carefully worded speech. I said yes because it was the right answer, the expected answer, the answer that made Mother smile, that particular smile she reserves for moments when we fulfill her dreams for us. But later, alone in my car, I caught myself calculating how many breaths it would take to carry me through the next 50 years of right answers. She turned the pages, finding an entry from 3 months ago. Watched Rachel and Michael today at the family brunch. They were arguing about modern art, her passionate defense of abstract expressionism, his methodical questioning of its merit. But it wasn't the argument that caught my attention. It was the way they both came alive in the disagreement, the way their eyes lit up, the way they leaned toward each other like flowers following the sun. I recognized the look on his face. It's the one I've been practicing in the mirror, trying to convince myself that contentment is the same thing as joy. The next entry was harder to read. The usually precise handwriting showing signs of agitation. Found the coffee shop receipt in Michael's wallet while looking for a business card. Rachel's doodles in the margins, little birds and flowers taking flight across the paper. My first thought wasn't jealousy, it was recognition. because I've spent my whole life drawing inside the lines, while Rachel's art always seems to dance beyond the borders. Maybe that's why he kept it. Maybe we all need a reminder that beauty doesn't always follow rules. 2 weeks before the wedding, Mother caught me looking at graduate school programs in Florence. She didn't say anything, just gave me that look, the one that reminds me of my responsibilities, my position, my role as the eldest Mitchell daughter. But for a moment, before I closed the laptop, I let myself imagine a life measured in brush strokes and restoration techniques instead of social obligations and charity board meetings. The application is hidden in my desk drawer, completed but unsent. Another might have been for my collection. The entry from the night before the wedding was brief. Rachel's been crying in her room for hours. The walls in this house have always been too thin for secrets. I wonder if she knows that every tear she sheds falls in time with my own heartbeat. Tomorrow, I'll walk down the aisle toward a good man who loves the idea of me, while my sister watches from the sidelines, holding the reality of herself back with both hands. We're both so good at our assigned roles, the responsible one and the rebel. But what if we're both just hiding in plain sight? And finally, this morning's entry, the ink barely dry. The wedding dress hangs on my door like a question. Rachel's bridesmaid dress lies on my bed like an answer. All my life, I've been the one who makes the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that keeps our family's world spinning smoothly on its axis. But watching my sister struggle with her heart these past months has taught me something. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is step aside and let love find its true path. I think I've always known Michael wasn't meant for me, not because he isn't wonderful, but because I'm not meant for the life we'd build together. A life of careful compromises and quiet resignations. There's an acceptance letter to the Florence Art Institute buried in my desk drawer, and a one-way ticket tucked inside my copy of The Portrait of a Lady. Maybe it's time for both Mitchell sisters to stop playing the roles we were assigned and start playing the lives we were meant to live. Rachel will wear my dress today. She'll walk down the aisle toward the man we both know she loves, with a fierceness I've never allowed myself to feel about anything except art and history and the beauty of things time has touched. And I'll wear her dress, stand in her place, and finally set us both free. Mother always said a Mitchell woman knows how to sacrifice for family. But maybe sometimes sacrifice looks like letting go of the life everyone expects you to want, so you can reach for the one that makes your heart beat in your ears like wings taking flight. Tomorrow, I'll be on a plane to Florence. Tonight, I'll watch my sister marry the man I was supposed to spend my life with. And for the first time since I can remember, both of those thoughts feel exactly right. Sarah closed the journal, its pages now holding the story of how 3 hearts found their way to truth through an unconventional path. Outside, she could hear Rachel's laughter mingling with Michael's deeper tones, their joy a counterpoint to the shocked whispers of departing guests. Her fingers found the acceptance letter in her pocket, its edges soft from constant touching. Tomorrow would bring Florence, and art and a life measured in restoration projects and cappuccinos instead of charity luncheons and social obligations. But tonight had brought something even more precious, the restoration of 3 souls to their authentic selves. As the reception hall emptied of shocked guests and disapproving relatives, Rachel found herself in the garden chapel's small library, still wearing the now torn wedding dress. Her hands trembled as she withdrew a worn envelope from her bouquet, a letter she'd written to Michael months ago, but never had the courage to send. Michael stood in the doorway, his tie loose, jacket discarded, looking more himself than he ever had in all their careful social interactions. "I think," he said softly, "it's time for the whole truth." Rachel nodded, unfolding the letter, its creases deep from countless refoldings. "Dear Michael, I'm writing this from that coffee shop where we first really talked. You know, the one with the mismatched cups and the barista who makes latte art that looks like famous paintings. She just served me a cappuccino with Van Gogh's Starry Night swirled in the foam, and I can hear your voice in my head explaining why that particular painting revolutionized modern art, even though you claim not to understand it. That's the thing about you, Michael. You understand everything deeply, thoroughly, completely, except maybe yourself. You analyze and categorize and make sense of the world through logic and reason, yet somehow you missed the moment we fell in love over a debate about whether abstract art could be objectively measured for quality. I've spent months watching you build a life with my sister, a life of careful plans and measured steps, each move calculated for maximum stability. You're so good at it, at being the man everyone expects you to be, just like Sarah is so good at being the woman everyone expects her to be. You're a matched set of perfectly polished expectations. But I've seen the real you, the you that comes, alive when challenged, that lights up when your carefully constructed worldview gets tilted on its axis. I've watched you doodle in the margins of legal briefs when you think no one's looking. Little sketches of buildings you dream of designing if you weren't bound by the weight of family legacy and corporate law. Do you remember that afternoon when it rained, and instead of calling your driver, we ran through the downpour laughing? You said something I'll never forget. Sometimes chaos is the only thing that makes sense. I don't think you meant to say it out loud, but there it was, the real Michael Coleman, peeking out from behind his perfect facade. I've tried to stop. Loving you, God knows I've tried. Sarah is my sister, my best friend, my other half in so many ways. She deserves a happy ending. But what if her happy ending isn't you? What if it's an art restoration studio in Florence and the freedom to stop being perfect? What if your happy ending isn't a life of careful choices and subdued passions? What if we're all just playing parts in a play none of us actually wrote? No, you keep that coffee shop receipt with my doodles in your wallet. I've seen you take it out when you think no one's watching, your fingers tracing the little birds I drew, taking flight across the paper. Those birds are us, Michael. All of us, you, me, Sarah, trying to break free from the cages we've built around ourselves. Sarah sees it too, though she'd never say it out loud. I've caught her watching us when we argue about art or philosophy or whether jazz is superior to classical music. She sees how we come alive in opposition, how our differences create harmony instead of discord. She's too kind, too responsible, too perfect to acknowledge it, but she knows she deserves more than a life built on quiet compromise. I'm not writing this to break anything. I'm writing because sometimes the truth demands to be put on paper, even if the paper never finds its intended recipient. I'm writing because loving you has taught me that the most beautiful things in life rarely fit into the boxes we try to contain them in. You'll marry my sister in 3 months, and I'll stand beside her in a sage green dress, smiling because that's what sisters do. You'll both build a life of elegant dinner parties and charitable boards and carefully curated contentment. The world will see exactly what it expects to see. But we'll both know that somewhere, in a coffee shop with mismatched cups and artistic lattes, there's a version of us that chose chaos over order, passion over perfection, truth over tradition. Maybe in another life, we're brave enough to listen to the sound of birds taking flight. Love, Rachel. The library was silent, save for the sound of paper being carefully refolded. Michael stood motionless, his lawyer's eloquence deserting him as the weight of unspoken truths finally found voice. "Those birds," he said finally, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing the worn coffee shop receipt. "I used to think they were flying away, but they're not, are they? They're flying home." Rachel looked up at him, still wearing her sister's torn wedding dress, finally free of the weight of secrets. "I never meant to fall in love with you," she whispered. "I know," he replied, moving closer, the receipt still in his hand. "Just like I never meant to keep a coffee shop doodle in my wallet for 8 months. Just like Sarah never meant to apply to art school in Florence. We've all been so busy, not meaning to be ourselves." The evening light filtered through the libraries. Stained glass windows, casting patterns across the torn wedding dress, across their joined hands, across the truth they'd finally allowed themselves to speak. "What happens now?" Rachel asked, though they both knew the answer was already written in the chaos they'd created, in the perfect plans they'd destroyed, in the authentic love they'd finally allowed to take flight. Michael's answer was simple. "Now we stop pretending." All of us. The wedding ring felt heavier now, as Michael rolled it between his fingers in the chapel's dim light. "Forever in perfect order." The inscription mocked him with its pristine certainty, its assumption that life could be contained, within carefully controlled boundaries. He remembered choosing those words, believing they captured everything he and Sarah represented. Two people who understood the value of structure, of plans, of doing things the right way. Now, sitting in a pew beside Rachel, both of them disheveled. From an evening of upending every careful plan, the ring seemed less like a symbol of commitment and more like evidence of a life he'd been performing rather than living. "I bought this ring at Tiffany's," he said quietly, watching it catch the light from the stained glass windows. "Made an appointment, of course. Spent 45 minutes discussing clarity and cut with an expert who treated diamonds like investments." It was exactly what everyone expected of Michael Coleman, rising star of corporate law, marrying the perfect Mitchell daughter. Rachel's hand found his, warm and real and nothing at all like an investment. And what would Michael Coleman, the man who sketches buildings in his legal briefs, have chosen? The question struck him like a physical blow. He thought of the architectural drawings hidden in his desk drawer, of the acceptance letter to graduate school for urban design that he'd never shown his parents, of all the dreams he'd filed away in favor of meeting expectations. "There's a small jeweler in the village," he admitted, his voice hardly more than a whisper. "His shop is chaos, gems scattered across velvet cloths, half-finished pieces hanging from copper wire trees. But every ring he makes tells a story. I used to pass by on my way to court, make up stories about the people who'd wear them. Why didn't you go in?" Michael closed his eyes, remembering. "I did. Once. The day before I bought this ring, actually. The owner was working on this incredible piece, rose gold that looked like it had grown naturally around a raw sapphire. It was imperfect, asymmetrical, absolutely alive. Everything this isn't." He held up the traditional diamond ring, its perfect proportions suddenly seeming sterile. "What stopped you?" "The same thing that stopped me at every crossroads. The weight of being Michael Coleman, eldest son, heir to the family firm, keeper of traditions. Do you know what my father said when I told him I'd been accepted to the urban design program at Columbia? 'Interesting hobby, son.' Now, about the Anderson merger?" Rachel's fingers tightened around his. "And what does Michael Coleman, the man sitting in a chapel at midnight with the wrong bride, want to say to his father now?" The ring caught the moonlight as he turned it, watching patterns dance across the polished surface. "That I'm tired of being the period at the end of other people's sentences, that maybe it's time to write my own story." He thought of Sarah, probably already packed for Florence, finally choosing her own path. Of Rachel, who had torn apart a perfect wedding to force them all to face their truths. Of himself, sitting here with a ring that represented everything he'd spent his life trying to be, finally ready to acknowledge who he actually was. "My mother will never forgive this," he said, but the words held more liberation than regret. The scandal, the broken engagement, the whispers at the club. "No," Rachel agreed, "she won't. Not for a long time. Maybe never. But will you forgive yourself if you don't choose your own happiness now?" Michael stood, moving to the altar where, hours ago, he'd waited for a bride, not yet knowing which sister would appear. The ring gleamed in his palm, heavy with expectations and traditions, and all the careful choices that had led him to this moment. "I used to think love was about finding someone who fit perfectly into your life," he said, his voice echoing slightly. "In the empty chapel. Like this ring, flawless, symmetrical, exactly what everyone expects. But real love, is about finding someone who makes you want to build a completely different life. He turned back to Rachel, seeing in her. Face everything he'd been afraid to want, challenge, passion, the possibility of a life colored outside the lines. The sapphire ring in the village, he said suddenly, the one that looked like it had grown wild around the stone. The jeweler said something I've never forgotten. Perfect symmetry exists in mathematics, son. Love exists in the beautiful flaws. Rachel stood, the torn wedding dress catching moonlight and shadows. And which do you choose? Michael looked down at the ring one last time, at its precise inscription, its perfect proportions, its weight of expectations. Then, with the certainty of someone finally choosing his own story, he placed it on the altar. I choose the beautiful. Flaws, he said. I choose midnight confessions in empty chapels. I choose coffee shop receipts with doodles of birds taking flight. I choose the sister who made me question everything instead of the one who would have helped me answer to everyone else. He reached for Rachel's hand, feeling the freedom of futures unwritten. I choose chaos over order, passion over perfection, truth over tradition. I choose us. The ring lay on the altar behind them, its inscription catching the last light of day, a reminder of the life they'd all been brave enough to leave behind in favor of lives they were finally brave enough to choose. The wedding photographer's camera lay abandoned on a reception table, its display screen cycling through images that told a story very different from the one it had been hired to capture. Eleanor Mitchell sat alone in the emptying hall, pressing the review button with deliberate slowness, watching the day unspool in reverse through the unblinking eye of the lens. The last photo showed Rachel and Michael in the garden, her in the torn wedding dress, him with his tie undone, both of them caught in a moment of unguarded joy. Their body language spoke of release, of walls finally broken, of truth finally spoken. It wasn't the elegant first dance photo the schedule had called for, but it held something far more precious: authenticity. Eleanor pressed the button again. Sarah appeared on the screen, wearing Rachel's bridesmaid dress, caught in profile as. She spoke to the remaining guests. The camera had captured something in her expression that years of society photographs had missed, a quiet certainty, a peace that came not from meeting expectations, but from finally setting them aside. I suppose you'll want to delete these, came a voice from behind her. Miranda Coleman stood there, face rigid with controlled anger, glass of scotch trembling slightly in her manicured hand. Wouldn't want evidence of this spectacle circulating. Eleanor studied the next image. Michael's father, Arthur Coleman, standing apart from the crowd, his usual commanding presence diminished. The camera had caught him in an unguarded moment, watching his son laugh with Rachel, his expression a complex mixture of disappointment and something that looked almost like envy. Actually, Eleanor said quietly, I think these might be the most important photographs the Mitchell family has ever taken. She moved to the next image, Rachel helping Michael's younger brother with his bow tie, both of them grinning as the formal wear rebelled against convention. They show us choosing joy over appearance, truth over tradition, love over legacy. Love. Miranda's voice cracked on the word. This isn't love, Eleanor. This is chaos. Your younger daughter stole my son from your eldest. How can you sit there so calmly? The next photograph answered for her. Sarah, caught in the moment she'd first seen Rachel and Michael together after the ceremony. Instead of betrayal, her face showed release. Instead of anger, liberation. Nobody stole anything, Miranda, Eleanor said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Sit, look, really look at what these pictures are telling us. Miranda remained standing, but her eyes fixed on the display as Eleanor continued through the images. Each one told part of the story. The exact moment Michael had recognized Rachel at the altar, his face transforming from confusion to awakening. The second, Sarah had stepped aside, strength rather than weakness in her posture. The instant Eleanor, herself had chosen to support truth over appearances, helping Rachel adjust the wedding dress that should have been Sarah's. "Your son," Eleanor said gently, "has spent his entire life trying to be who you and Arthur wanted him to be. The perfect corporate lawyer, the ideal eldest son. Today, he finally chose to be himself. By humiliating our families? By throwing away everything we built for him?" Eleanor paused on a particular photo. Miranda and Arthur on their own wedding day, a shot the photographer had found in the family archives to incorporate into today's collection. Two very young people standing perfectly straight, perfectly unhappy. "Tell me, Miranda," Eleanor said softly, "when was the last time you saw Arthur's eyes light up the way Michael's do when he's talking about architecture? When was the last time you felt the kind of joy we saw in that garden tonight?" The Scotch glass trembled again. "We gave him everything, except permission to be himself." The next photo showed Michael's desk at the law firm, captured during the getting ready shots that morning. In the corner, partially hidden behind law books, sat a stack of architectural drawings. The camera had caught what everyone else had missed, dreams deferred but never quite abandoned. "He'll lose his position at the firm," Miranda said, but her voice held less certainty now. "Arthur won't stand for this impulsive decision." Eleanor turned to another image, Arthur alone in the garden later in the evening, holding something that looked like an old photograph. The camera's zoom had captured its detail, a much younger Arthur in front of an art gallery, paintbrush in hand. "Perhaps," Eleanor suggested, "it's time we all stopped standing for lives half-lived in service to expectations." The final photo appeared on the screen, the three young people at the center of today's transformation, caught in a moment of shared understanding. Rachel in the torn wedding dress that somehow looked more beautiful for its imperfections. Michael, his perfect posture relaxed for the first time in memory. And Sarah, radiant in the bridesmaid's dress, Florence's acceptance letter visible in her hand. Miranda sank slowly into the chair, her scotch untouched. "Everything will change after this." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, turning off the camera, letting the images and their truths settle into the quiet of the empty reception hall. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" Outside, they could hear laughter. Michael and Rachel still in the garden, planning futures unbound by others' expectations. From upstairs came the sound of Sarah's footsteps as she packed for Florence, each step taking her closer to her own truth. The wedding photographer's camera had captured not just the end of one carefully planned ceremony, but the beginning of three authentically lived lives. In years to come, these would be the pictures the Mitchell and Coleman families would return to, not to remember a scandal, but to mark the moment they all began to question what tradition had cost them, and what breaking free might offer in return. The marriage certificate lay on the antique desk in Eleanor's study, its crisp edges softened by the lamp's warm glow. Rachel's signature, her own name, not her sister's, stood out boldly against the cream-colored paper, a testament to one truth among many that had emerged that day. "Well," said James Harrison, the family's longtime lawyer, adjusting his reading glasses as he studied the document, "legally speaking, this is actually rather straightforward. Rachel signed her own name, not Sarah's. The certificate is valid." Michael stood by the window, his corporate law training warring with his personal relief. "So there's no need for annulment or legal intervention?" "No," James replied, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Though I must say, in 40 years of family law, I've never seen quite such an elegant solution to a complex emotional situation." Rachel sat in one of the leather armchairs, still wearing the torn wedding dress, her fingers intertwined with Michael's. "I couldn't start our life together with a lie," she said quietly, "even if the ceremony itself was unconventional." The older lawyer's eyes crinkled with understanding. "My dear, I've seen countless conventional ceremonies lead to lifetimes of lies, Perhaps we could all learn something from your commitment to truth. Sarah entered the study then, carrying a stack of papers, documents Eleanor recognized from her own desk drawer. I found them, Mother, all of them. She laid them out beside the marriage certificate, her Florence acceptance letter, Rachel's teaching credentials, Michael's architectural school application, and beneath them all, the faded photograph of Aunt Helen and Margaret in Paris. A paper trail of dreams deferred, Eleanor mused, touching each document. Until now. James picked up the Florence acceptance letter, scanning it with professional interest. The semester starts in 2 weeks, quite a quick transition. No quicker than switching brides at the altar, Sarah replied, and for the first time that day they all laughed, a release of tension that had been building for years. There will be practical matters to address, James continued, slipping into the comfortable role of family advisor. The Coleman firm's partnership track, the Mitchell family trust conditions, social obligations, all designed, Eleanor interrupted gently, to keep us living lives that were planned for us, not by us. She picked up the photo of Helen and Margaret. My aunt chose love over inheritance 60 years ago. The family survived. More than survived, Sarah added, touching the acceptance letter. Her art gallery in Paris funded this scholarship. She turned her scandal into a legacy of helping others choose their own paths. Michael moved from the window to stand behind Rachel's chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. The firm will survive without another Coleman partner. The trust will survive without another Mitchell Society wedding. The question is, will we survive if we keep choosing safety over authenticity? James removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. You know, when my grandson came out last year, my first thought was about the family image. My second thought was about his trust fund conditions. But my lasting thought, he smiled, replacing his glasses, was how his whole being lit up when he finally spoke his truth, rather like you three today. Rachel reached for the marriage certificate, her finger tracing her own signature. So what happens now? Now, James said, beginning to gather the documents into his briefcase, you begin the interesting part, living lives of your own choosing. He paused, selecting his words carefully. It won't be easy. Society has a long memory for what it considers scandals, but in my experience it has a very short attention span for others' happiness. Sarah picked up her acceptance letter, holding it like a talisman. Florence is 5,000 miles from Newport Gossip. And Greenwich Village, Michael added, thinking of the architectural firms there, is just far enough from the family firm to build something new. Eleanor watched them, her daughters and the man who had helped them all choose truth over tradition, seeing not the scandal that would rock their social circle, but the courage that would reshape their lives. The marriage certificate, she said finally, is just paper and ink. Like all these documents, they don't create our lives, they merely record the choices we make. She stood, moving to her desk drawer to withdraw one final paper, her own acceptance. Letter dated 30 years ago. To a conservation program she'd declined in favor of maintaining family expectations. Perhaps it's time we all wrote new records. James closed his briefcase with a decisive click. Well then, shall we make it official? As of this moment, the marriage of Rachel Mitchell and Michael Coleman is legally recognized. Sarah Mitchell's place at the Florence Art Institute is confirmed. And, he smiled at Eleanor, it's never too late to file an application for conservation studies. The study fell quiet as they absorbed the weight of these new truths, these chosen paths. Outside, the garden where a very different ceremony had been planned still held its white roses and elegant chairs. But inside this room, surrounded by papers that represented both endings and beginnings, 4 people sat in the presence of authenticity, that rarest of family heirlooms, finally claimed. 3 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, Eleanor found the box of thank you cards in Sarah's old room. 200 cream-colored notes, each one pre-addressed in her eldest daughter's precise handwriting to the carefully curated guest list. The message inside had been pre-printed, awaiting only personal additions and signatures. Mr. and Mrs. Michael Coleman, thank you for sharing in their joy. She sat on Sarah's stripped bed, surrounded by the gentle ghost of her daughter's former life, and began to read the morning's letters that had arrived from her scattered children. From Florence, Sarah wrote of Renaissance techniques and ancient pigments, of hands stained with centuries-old colors. Yesterday I spent 6 hours cleaning a small corner of a Botticelli. Time moves differently here, Mother. Not in careful quarter hours passed between social obligations, but in gentle waves of discovery. I think I understand now why Aunt Helen chose Paris. Some cities don't just welcome us, they recognize us. From Greenwich Village, Rachel and Michael's joint letter arrived in an envelope illustrated with Rachel's characteristic doodles. The architect we met yesterday didn't even blink when Michael mentioned leaving law. The best designs, she said, come from people who understand the value of restructuring their own foundations. We're living above a coffee shop that makes terrible cappuccinos but feels more like home than any penthouse ever did. Eleanor looked at the stack of unsent thank you cards, each one a small monument to the life they'd all expected to live. With deliberate care, she began to write new messages. To the Newport Garden Club board. The Mitchell family thanks you for your many years of support. Please accept our resignation from the annual charity gala committee. We are pursuing other paths of community engagement. To the Coleman family law partners. Thank you for your guidance of Michael's career thus far. He has chosen to follow his architectural aspirations. Sometimes the truest legacy is the courage to build something new. To Miranda and Arthur Coleman. Thank you for raising a son brave enough to choose happiness over expectation. When you're ready to see the joy in his choice, you'll find him designing buildings that reach for sky instead of security. To the Newport Social Register, the Mitchell family. Thanks you for generations of inclusion. We now choose to measure our lives in moments of authenticity rather than hours of obligation. She worked through the afternoon, transforming each pre-printed card into a declaration of independence from the life they'd all once thought they had to live. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Sarah's empty room, a final letter arrived, this one from Paris, addressed in handwriting she hadn't seen in decades. Dearest Eleanor, Margaret read about the wedding in the international papers. Mitchell daughter swaps places at altar, scandal rocks Newport society. We laughed until we cried, then opened a bottle of champagne on our balcony overlooking Montmartre. After 60 years, we're still considered scandalous by Newport standards. And after 60 years, we're still deliriously happy. I've transferred the gallery's scholarship fund into Sarah's name. Let her use it to support other young artists brave enough to choose their own path. And tell Rachel that Margaret and I are renewing our vows next spring. We'd be honored if she and Michael would consider having their own ceremony here. One unburdened by expectations, witnessed only by those who celebrate love in all its unconventional glory. All my love, Aunt Helen. Eleanor set the letter among the thank you cards, watching the evening light play across their expensive surfaces. Each one had been chosen to convey perfect gratitude for a perfect wedding. Instead, they would carry messages of transformation, of liberation, of lives chosen rather than assumed. She thought of Sarah in Florence, hands stained with the colors of centuries past, learning to restore beauty that time had hidden. Of Rachel and Michael in their village apartment, designing spaces that reached for dreams instead of security. Of herself, holding an application to a conservation program, finally ready to preserve something other than appearances. The thank you cards caught the last light of day, their gold embossing gleaming like promises. Eleanor began to write one final note, this one to herself. Thank you for the life I thought I had to live, for the careful choices the measured steps, the perfectly maintained facade. Without that structure, I might never have recognized the sound of walls crumbling as music. Without that weight, my children might never have understood the glory of choosing their own gravity. Thank you for every expectation that taught us the value of disappointment, for every tradition that showed us what we didn't want to become, for every perfect plan that fell apart beautifully. Most of all, thank you for falling apart exactly on schedule, making way for something real to grow in the spaces between what we were supposed to be and who we actually are. She sealed the last envelope just as the room fell into darkness, surrounded by thank you cards that would never be sent but had served their purpose anyway, becoming witnesses to the moment a family chose authenticity over approval, love over legacy, truth over tradition. 1 year later, a new photograph joined the Mitchell family gallery, not formally posed on the Newport lawn, but candidly captured in a Parisian garden. Helen and Margaret's renewal ceremony had drawn them all to France, bringing together a family reconstructed by courage and choice rather than obligation. In the center, Rachel and Michael stood beneath a bower of climbing roses, her artist's smock splattered with paint, his architectural drawings peeking from a portfolio at their feet. Sarah sat cross-legged on the grass beside them, wearing restoration gloves stained with the colors of centuries. Eleanor stood with her sister Catherine, their conservation work badges catching the light. And at the heart of it all, Helen and Margaret, still radiant after 60 years of choosing love over convention. The photographer caught the moment just as a breeze scattered rose petals across the scene, nature's own celebration of imperfect beauty and perfect truth. Forever in beautiful disorder, read the frame's inscription, each word a testament to lives finally lived in full color, outside the lines of expectation.